up to the floor for discussion. I'm Hazelkorn. I'm one of the international co-investigators here at CGHE. I'm a former policy advisor to the Higher Education Authority in Ireland, which is the government agency for higher education. And I also run the Higher Education Policy Research Unit at Dublin Institute of Technology, amongst other things. So I will introduce the panel in a moment. A few comments maybe to start us off, and to again thank you very much for coming after certainly a very exhilarating first talk. As I said to Professor Ignatia when I met him upstairs, I'm old enough to remember him on Newsnight, and it was really quite an occasion. So the issue of equality is really a big one for us. Probably the most disturbing part of the entire equality equity debate is that despite all the analysis and action over many decades, inequality remains stubbornly persistent. We know that education is an indicator of future life chances, but we also know, yet all the research, that educational achievement at age 8 can determine our earnings by age 36. Participation in training by low-skilled adults is so low that there's little reason to believe this will change. And this is at a time when life expectancy and changes in the labor market are changing dramatically. Countries and universities have introduced widening access initiatives and targeted funding, but their impact has remained relatively limited. The reasons as to why some individuals or groups are more successful than others varies depending on perspective, and how much responsibility for success is placed on the individual learner versus societal and structural arrangements, the impact of family and societal background on educational outcomes, inadequate provision, or other barriers to entry. Much of the discussion around equity has been concerned with participation rates and program quality rather than on access to what, and issues around growing stratification and differentiating levels of learning and success. We're familiar with individual initiatives at college and university level, such as college awareness programs, mentoring programs, working with schools, working with groups of students, helping students to get college ready, as one might say in the U.S., lots of summer school initiatives, bilateral links between individual universities and further education or secondary schools. We're also familiar with many national initiatives. Some of these are sought to establish parallel educational routes, some of them beginning very early. In the UK context, as I would say, think 11 plus, which remained in Northern Ireland until quite a long time. Or in other jurisdictions, we've had binary divisions between vocational and academic tracking, and we've also had varying other kinds of system reforms and changes in the way in which institutions are structured. What these developments have shown us, however, is that individual initiatives are, as I said, limited. Many of them are actually exercises in creaming, where the universities themselves act as permanent gatekeepers. We also know that as systems expand, there's a tendency to become increasingly more differentiated and hierarchically organized, stratifying opportunity rather than tackling structured inequality. Education systems can be a force for social mobility, but they also reproduce and reinforce social divides. Indeed, arguably, many of the universities spend most of their time trying to keep out students than let them in. Many of the promises promoted by and about higher education, most notably about social and economic upward mobility, are proving to be untrue, or at least untrue for too many. However, rather than owning the problems of poor quality schooling or unsatisfactory health outcomes, for example, Nancy Zimfer, who's a former chancellor of the State University of New York, has said that higher education institutions and their faculty, having educated the teachers and their doctors, have simply walked away. What happens beyond the campus is of no interest, either before students enter or indeed once they graduate. And indeed, the issue of employability is an issue that many people find offensive. In addition to little attention has been placed on the adult learner, on the concept of lifelong learning, as I said at a time when life expectancy will enable most of our students to live into the next century. We think about what that means in terms of ability to live, and these people coming in and out of the education system, that's a big issue. And in preference for universities concentrating primarily on students and research, which bring increasingly reputational advantage. So this panel is going to try and discuss these enduring issues, which, as Piketty has acknowledged, confound every country. To date, no country has come up with a truly satisfactory response. Some of the questions and issues that we'd like to discuss are such as, what do we know now about inequality or equity in higher education that we didn't know before? We know a lot of stuff. So when we're at this, I'd like to go beyond rhetoric, beyond what we already know and talking about. What do we know now we didn't know before? What are the outstanding big questions and issues that we need to resolve, and the key policy challenges? Higher education may not be responsible, but what are its responsibilities in this area? And by taking a systematic or systemic view of the educational pipeline, recognizing that what happens in preschool is probably where most of the issues start, are there realistic models of good practice that have proven to work? So in introducing our panel, we have 4 speakers, very interestingly, as we said, multicultural, and predominantly women. So we are going to have the answers. So if I go in the order of our speakers, just a brief introduction is Vikki Boliver, professor of sociology at Durham. Then we have Dung, who's a research fellow at the Australian National University. Before that, she was with the World Bank. Then we have Rajani Naidoo, who's a professor of higher education and director of the International Center for Higher Education Management at Bath. And then finally, we have Ben Whittaker, who's the NUS director, National Union of Students director for the Student Voice, and influenced previously working at the University of West London and having studied at Durham. So you're all very welcome, and so our speakers are going to talk for about 7 minutes max each, and then we're going to open up to a dialogue. So with that, we'll introduce our first speaker, Vikki.
Hi everybody. I guess the thrust of what I want to say to you is that we need to take a very different tack if we're going to make any progress whatsoever on widening access to higher education in the UK and other countries. We have massive discrepancies between high and low income students in terms of going to university at all. It's even worse when we look at the most prestigious academically selected universities. Things haven't changed very much in decades, despite the fact that for a long, long time, widening participation concerns have been really high on the policy agenda. There have been many, many initiatives, from expansion of the number of university places through to lots of widening participation initiatives trying to tackle this problem. And I think if we look at the trends over time, your heart sinks when you look at how much progress we've made, despite the massive political will, however, and the amount of resources we've invested. And I don't really want to be talking about this in 10, 20, 30 years' time as it feels we have done so far. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I think we can take a very different approach to genuinely widening participation in higher education, especially in the most elite universities. And I think what we have to do is recognise initially that probably, most certainly, the biggest barrier to widening participation, not the things that we've often focused on, like trying to widen, trying to improve aspirations. Aspirations are in abundance among low-income working class students. Where the real sticking point comes is that school achievement is really difficult to improve for students from disadvantaged communities. And universities, particularly the most prestigious ones, that's the currency that they use to determine who has the merit, who has the worth to attend university. They judge people based on their prior achievements as evidenced in credentials at school. And we know that apart from, perhaps London is the exception here, that socioeconomic inequalities in schooling, in school achievement at GCSE and A-level haven't really, the gap hasn't really closed over time, and it's very unlikely to do so when we consider that the disadvantaged socioeconomic circumstances inevitably impact on the capacity for low-income students to do well in school. And even though we know this, universities like this one, like my own university, are setting the bar really high for admission to university. At my university, the most accessible courses ask for AAB. Many of them ask for 2 or 3 A stars at A-level. The bar is set extremely high, and the bar is set not particularly for pedagogical reasons, but for market reasons. You know, the demand for places at these universities is sufficiently high that they can raise the price, and the price, of course, is the entry requirements. So we have a system of admission to universities that I would label a formal meritocracy. The bar is set pretty high, and institutions like this one and my own very high for everybody. It's formally meritocratic in the sense that everybody is held to the same account and has to jump over the same hurdle. And it's meritocratic, I would say, in the naive sense that there's an assumption, which everybody secretly knows isn't really a correct assumption, that grades at GCSE and A-level are adequate and accurate and objective indicators of the merit or worth or academic potential of students. We know that that's not true, but we persist in pretending that grades are everything, and those with the highest grades are the ones who deserve to go to university, particularly the most prestigious ones. So that's a formal meritocracy that we have at the moment. And I'm drawing on the work of John Rawls in distinguishing between formal equality of opportunity and fair equality of opportunity. And what I'm going to suggest is that we need to shift away from a formal meritocracy to a fair meritocracy, and that means not naively thinking that grades indicate merit and that there is a level playing field on which operate in order to demonstrate that merit through the examination system. I think if we're going to make significant gains in widening participation, we absolutely need to move from a formal to a fair meritocracy. And really key to this is taking a contextualised approach to setting entry requirements and judging whether students meet the requirements to go to university. So if you take the sociology degree at Durham, it's one of the lowest entry requirements for Durham, it's AAB. AAB is well within the reach of advantaged students, right? In fact, if you go to a high fee paying private school, if you come out with AAB, Mum and Dad are going to want their money back, actually, aren't they? You know? So AAB is well within the reach of advantaged students, but it's actually a real struggle for those from low-income backgrounds to reach that bar of AAB, given the circumstances, neighbourhoods, communities, schools in which they grow up. Something like 3 Cs would actually be a really exceptional performance, for example, from someone who's been on free school meals and their families on income support throughout their school histories. So I think what we need to do is contextualise people's school achievement to fully recognise the merit and the potential that they have. We can't assume that grades are objective indicators. We need to really think about these things in context. You may be aware that quite a lot of universities are already doing this to a modest degree, thinking about reducing entry requirements for disadvantaged students by maybe a grade, maybe 2 grades. So instead of A star and 2 A's, you can come with 3 A's. This is a welcome development, but I think we're going to need to go much, much further if we're going to use contextualised admissions and fair meritocracy to make a real dent on widening participation. Maybe I do have a minute to just think a little bit about some of the critiques of taking a contextualised admissions and a fair meritocratic approach to tackling the problem of equal access to higher education. And these critiques often come from within the universities themselves, sometimes from university teachers, sometimes from the spokespeople for Universities UK or the Russell Group. And the argument sometimes is made that it's not the place of universities to make good the disadvantages and the inequalities that have started much, much earlier in the education process and are due to much sort of wider social influences and processes. And allied to that, they might often say that it shouldn't really be a university's responsibility to offer remedial education, catch-up education. I would counter that by saying that universities absolutely have a role to play in promoting fairness and equity and in doing what they can to correct social injustices that have occurred elsewhere in the system. And the main place that universities have power and autonomy to make some changes is precisely with regard to their admissions criteria and their admissions procedures. I would also say that universities actually have the resources, both financial resources and personnel resources, to deliver the kinds of education that will be required of contextually disadvantaged students. I wouldn't call it remedial, but I would certainly say there's a need for catch-up education, support with study skills and so on. The kind of genuine teaching that we often don't need to do in universities, because usually the students that we encounter will walk out the door with a 2-1 with marginal input from ourselves. Universities are very well placed to provide that kind of learning support for potentially disadvantaged students. So just to close, I would say that if we're going to do anything to stop us from having this conversation again and again and again with no progress, we really need to take a good look at what we mean by merit and take a much more contextualised approach to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Is it working? Yeah. So I want to bring the discussion on inequality in higher education to the context of developing country. Think about a country like India, China, Vietnam, Philippines, where rapid economic growth has led to an expanding middle class. And this middle class mainly drives both the demand for higher education and the enrollment in higher education. Those who are left out of the higher education market in those countries tend to be from low-income households. They are of ethnic minorities. They are concentrated in remote, poor rural communities all at once, because there is a strong correlation between household income and local facility and ethnicity and other socio-economic indicators. Those most disadvantaged students tend to drop out of secondary school well before they finish secondary school, let alone thinking about higher education. Because in their communities, the school are poorly equipped. The school are severely understaffed, or sometimes school doesn't exist at all. For those who are lucky to finish secondary school, their decision to apply for higher education is constrained not only about the ability of their family to finance higher education, but also by the demand for them to contribute to their household income. At the other end of the spectrum, the most privileged students seek higher education overseas, mostly in North America, in Europe, in Australia, because of better job prospects after obtaining an overseas degree, and also because of the higher quality of higher education in those high-income countries. Now, so my view is that in order to improve equal access in higher education in a developing country, two things need to be done. They are the intervention before admission to higher education and at the point of admission to education. Now, this is not, in principle, this is not very different from what needs to be done in higher income country. But the poorer the country, the lower the country in the development ladders, the higher is the policy focus on improving schooling outcomes. And this involves a range of factors, including household investment in the cognitive and physical development of young children, the availability, the affordability, the accessibility of schools and teachers, demand for child laborers, the social bias against women, education, and so on and so forth. So none of these is really new. We have known all of these for a long time. But the two critical things that I would suggest is that it is very important to identify the most important drivers or constraints to schooling outcome in poor communities. What are these? And then develop a comprehensive, coordinated approach to address them simultaneously in order to break the perpetual circle of poverty and poor schooling outcome. Because building a school alone is not enough if we don't attract and retain qualified teachers there. Providing school meals is not enough if the kids need to walk 2 hours through muddy road through a mountain to reach the school. Sponsoring school equipment is not enough if the school doesn't have electricity, or if no one at the school knows how to operate those equipments. Improving girls' education is not enough if child's marriage is prevalent and if the job opportunities in the local market for young girls is limited. So there is a demand for intellectual efforts and policy determination to look at each community and each region within a country and then identify what is the constraint here, what is the bottlenecks, and how to solve it. Policy intervention needs to be customized according to the local community instead of having a broad policy, say, to build school and provide school equipment across the country. But more often than not, government and NGO tend to apply that sort of single aspect intervention, partly because they are easier to implement, easier to design, easier to evaluate, and easier to scale up. But at the end of the day, doing single aspect intervention is not going to be very effective. Now, at the other end of the process, at the point of admission, I believe that financial support to poor students is very important in order to have them not only to attend university, but to stay and complete their degree. Because evidence from countries like Vietnam or South Korea, for example, show that students from lower socioeconomic status tend to work more part-time during their study and have poorer performance, which affect their ability to get a good job after graduation. And again, the importance of having financial assistance to students is important in developing countries because in those countries, they tend not to have a well-established student loan system. They tend to rely on grant and scholarship, which is more burdensome to the government budget. As compared to a student loan system, if it is well designed, the government can get most of the money back. From my research, what I believe is when a loan system is well designed, an income contingent loan system, like the one in Australia or New Zealand, is preferred to a town-based loan system, like what we see in the US. Am I up?
No, you have 1 minute.
I think I will leave it there for this discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I would like to focus on equality as a global issue, particularly in relation to the global competition fetish. And this is, of course, the blind faith that competition in higher education will contribute to all that is good, including increasing equality. In general, of course, we know that different types of competition actually enhance inequality and not equality. At the apex of this competition is, of course, the battle for world-class university status. And this is a battle that is fought between the most prestigious universities in the richest countries. However, the ripples are felt far beyond these elite battlefields. World-class universities become aspirational models for institutions everywhere. So rather than having different types of higher education institutions, both academic and vocational, in a very good, high-functioning post-secondary institution, instead of having different types of institutions that are valued, that actually give students greater choice, that may open the door to more equity, what we have is all institutions trying to emulate and mimic the most powerful ones and losing. And I think in the end we are getting very, very highly diverse higher education systems, but it's not diverse or differentiated in terms of choice or in terms of function. It's differentiated in terms of status and perhaps quality, and that's exactly what does not lead to equality. Pierre Bourdieu has argued that it is not individual universities that contribute to inequality in society. It is actually how the higher education system works as a whole. In highly stratified systems, national resources are swallowed up by world-class universities or by universities that may be identified as world-class. These universities are tasked with the function of bringing in prestige and status, and of course very, very high quality research. This is often diametrically opposed to greater equality. Few benefits trickle down from the world-class universities to enhance the system as a whole. In fact, the most disadvantaged institutions that attract the greatest numbers of disadvantaged students get very, very little benefit from this whole model. And the question for me, therefore, is, given that world-class universities consume so much of the national resources, should they not be given the responsibility of enhancing equality? Should they not be given the responsibility of actually building capacity in national systems of higher education? Should we not be focusing on creating world-class universities? Should we be focusing instead on creating world-class systems? Simon Marginson has very helpfully extended Pierre Bourdieu's concept of national fields of higher education to conceptualize global fields of higher education. These global power contests lead to what I have termed the combined and unequal development of higher education. There are growing numbers of high-status, well-resourced universities in poorer countries, which recruit the most elite in the country. These universities partner with the global elite. They apply decontextualized measures of academic merit, and they connect graduates to global power nodes. At the same time, the richest countries in the world have rising numbers of institutions designated as low status. They recruit the most disadvantaged students in the country. They are very, very poorly resourced, and they are constrained in very many different ways. So what do we do? Firstly, I think we try our best to stop policymakers focusing on world-class universities as if they exist in some form of a vacuum. We redirect their focus through our research and through policy advocacy to how national and global systems of higher education can work together to contribute to greater equality. Secondly, we avoid separating access, quality education, and research excellence. We need to bring these all together in some form of win-win relationship in all higher education systems. And it can be done. I want to give a very inspirational example in this respect from Colombia in Latin America. Jose Restrepo has recently spoken about how Colombian universities are responding to the peace accord that has emerged in Colombia after decades of violent conflict. He talks about how the most prestigious and the most powerful, the oldest universities in Colombia are actually transforming themselves to contribute directly to peace and to consolidate democracy. He talks about how they've set out a comprehensive program for the next 3 decades. That's very, very long-term planning, which includes curriculum change so that all undergraduates in science, in arts, and in the humanities are exposed to the need for reconciliation and forgiveness. He talks about a huge rise in scholarships for students from the poorest and the most violent regions. He talks about how universities are reaching out to ex-guerrillas and to people who were combatants and bringing them into higher education, and how all of this is linked to an interdisciplinary research program that addresses inequality, access to public goods, not just higher education, but health and welfare, and also political participation. Thank you.
So, in the introduction, we were told that universities there's lots of talk about universities not doing enough, and that it's part of a wider social problem that exists within our society, and that's true. I want to argue, though, that universities, I would say, are, in some respects, the gatekeepers of driving down inequality. We are a danger of reproducing inequality in society. And I think little movement has been made, and we should actively talk about that. We've seen access to universities not increase for some of the poorest in our society. Let's look at London. We're sitting in one of the elite universities, to use the word the best, and then we've got the rest, all around the M25, where most of the black students go, most of the poor students go, most of the mature students go, most of the people with caring responsibilities go. And we know why that happens. The first speaker articulates that very well. But what does that mean in reality for students? It means the law student that turns up at a modern university is completely unaware of day one of enrolment that the big law firm in Canary Wharf, who run a graduate scheme, will not even consider coming on that campus to offer them a chance to become one of the best lawyers in the world. That's a shame. That's a real shame for that student who's spending a lot of money with the hope and dream of making a better life for their family, to know that the doors are already closed for them. What about the fact that some of the student unions in the best are funded to the tune of £2-3 million to enrich the lives of students who are already getting 2As and have probably had quite an enriching cultural capital through their school life? Turn up at the LSE or UCL and rock up to a 4-storey building full of activities and societies and clubs that you can get involved in. Where if you go down the road to one of those modern universities that may be funded to the tune of £200,000, it's do-it-yourself craftivism, which doesn't have the same impact on your CV later on in your life. And let's look at access. I don't know how many of you are on Facebook and Twitter. I like to say some stuff. I recently was watching a video in America of a black student who got accepted into one of the best universities. Did anybody see it? There was like 30 students in their college all sat around the student who was live refreshing the page. Refreshed the page and got in, and everyone went absolutely crazy. And Ellen DeGeneres put them on the sofa and was having a chat with them. They're on all the news channels. What no one did was look underneath that video at all of the comments that were made by black students in America who said, wow, good for them, but what about the rest of us? Because we fetishise access. I'm sick to death of walking around London particularly and seeing on the side of buildings one or two of the great showcases that we know, when the rest of students are blocked out of that access. And it's really interesting when I was talking to Shakira, who will be here today, about this. She said, when I see those billboards, when I see those prospectuses and I see those case studies, they don't look like me or my friends or anybody who I have grown up with. And I have to make a choice about whether I want to change my identity and change my life to fit into something else. And what are the consequences of that? If you go to the best, you're surrounded by the best world-class research. You'll probably talk more about research. As a result, you're more likely to become a researcher and be involved in higher education. If you're in a modern university, that may not be the case for you. If you go to the best, you have access to courses that I could never have dreamed of. I went to the University of Derby. I'd have loved to study PPE, but that option wasn't available to me because of my grade entry requirements. I was not able to access that course. So I'm told already that I am not allowed to do that. And we know that if you're a history graduate or a philosophy graduate, you earn the most. So, nice one. We are in danger in our own structures of reproducing that privilege. Interestingly, I was looking at a case study around nursing recently, where what you've seen is the emergence of big medical schools in the best institutions, and they've now realised they want to bring nursing in as a valuable income stream, but also to increase research output as the government prioritises healthcare research. What does that do, though, to a traditionally vocational course? It means that what you get is the elite moving into courses such as King's, where there is a nursing course now, which is one of the best nursing courses in the country, but actually it is now changing the way that course is being accessed by lots of people and changing the way in which we are teaching. It's becoming less vocational. A nurse at King's potentially now is someone who didn't get onto a medical course, which I think is interesting when you compare that to my institution where I worked before, University of West London, which was a mainly mature vocational group of people going in to access nursing. So this year, Shakira has been prioritising the Poverty Commission. First time NUS has done some work on class and poverty and what does that do for your access into education. That will be released next Tuesday, and I'm embargoed, so I'm not allowed to talk about it. But there is some very interesting work that NUS is now starting to do at looking at how your class has an impact on your journey through education. And what we know is that your cultural capital and your economic capital are completely linked, and that journey throughout HE, it is connected. So when poor students run out of money, they have to stop engaging with university life. They don't get any of the benefits of being in wonderful HE because they've run out of money, and there's definitely something we should do about that. One of the other priority areas of work that we're looking at is black attainment. The black attainment gap is criminal. Nobody does enough about it. If I see one more piece of thinking and the evidence collection, we've done enough of this. It's time for us to actually move into action. Again, when students walk through the door, they're never told the reality of what the attainment gap is in an institution, and if they were, would they go? And at that point, I think we all have a responsibility to deal with that issue. Shakira always says to me, it's not just about getting in, it's about getting on. Student poverty is a real issue. It is a real issue in an institution. Accommodation costs in this city alone are higher than your loan. So on day one, we know that students do not have enough money to do anything else other than pay their rent. And in most cases, that isn't even enough covered by their loan. So maintenance is a real issue, and we will be pushing in the new student support review for a better system of maintenance for students whilst they're there. But I want to go back to, often we talk about the word HE, institutions, is that we all could do things to make life better in terms of inequality. Back to basics, learning and teaching, creating lectures, creating environments that meet the needs of individual students rather than the masses. Assessment. I was in a university the other week and I saw week 6 of a stage 4 course, a 3,000 word book review. Well, for some students that's probably not possible, and that's their first assessment they would have in an institution. And they're probably going to fail, and at that point they're probably going to leave. And I think there's stuff that we could do around assessment that would make a difference. But I want to go back to that point about fetishising access and fetishising the way in which we deliver inequality. I often think that people forget to go and talk to the masses about their experiences. We often use the breakthrough person, the person that's made the most. We give an award to the champion that broke all the adversity. Whereas actually the reality for lives of students through students' eyes is not that. They look about their perspective is based upon the people they live with, the people they engage with, the people they see, the people in their communities. And they're not represented in our universities. They're not represented really in this room probably. They're not represented in our management structures. They're not represented in our course structures. So we have a duty to go out and engage those people in a non-patronising way and work out it's not just about the people that break through, it's also about the people who we exclude. And I think by giving those people a voice, we could truly revolutionise the way in which we do access.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks to our 4 speakers who have really set this off. We've got 4 different perspectives, but all onto the same sets of issues as to what works, owning the problem. If I go back to that comment by Nancy Zimfer, and what is higher education's responsibility? We'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear comments as much as Q&A. So if we could take some kinds of comment. I think I'll go from Nicola's example in the first bit and try and get 3 initially, and then we'll respond and then come back and see how that goes. So, right. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. Tristan McCowan, UCL. Thank you for a really great panel. For the most part, the view that was that was put forward was one of redistribution. We had a slightly different view from Rajani, who's looking at the hegemonic and homogenising influence of world-class universities and open up the question of differentiation. But to a large extent, discussions around equality of higher education are ones around that take the notion of higher education as a given and think about how to allocate it fairly. To puzzling through how we might actually do that. And I wanted to ask the panel about the recognition element as well as the redistribution one. To what extent do we really have equality in higher education if people are going to a university that does not reflect their cultural, linguistic, intellectual background? This is obviously particularly relevant in countries that may have many different groups with diverse intellectual traditions, some of which are not acknowledged in the university or may actually be actively denigrated in that space. And to what extent might equality in higher education actually involve the development of new forms of university, new forms of institution, new forms of higher learning?
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Emma Dung, I'm a journalist for The Economist. There was an implicit admission, I think, from one of the panelists, that with a reference to the fetishization of world-class universities, that there is a trade-off between excellence and equity. And I'd like to hear from all of the panel members about whether they are happy to sacrifice excellence for equity.
Okay, good provocative question. And someone
I
here.
can shout among
Rebecca Shendel, also UCL. Most of you, with the exception of the last panelist and Rajani, was taking a different view. At least the first two were really talking about access in terms of getting into university, not what happens afterwards, and you were definitely picking up on that. I want to push, speaking as somebody who works on a widening participation undergraduate program, we've had to do a lot of work to sort of help the faculty understand the different kinds of students that are in their classroom as opposed to students they've taught on master's courses and other sorts of courses here. It also takes a lot of time to change curricula, to change teaching approaches, and it requires a lot of funding that we haven't been given. So what do you, even for those who make it to an elite institution, there's often not funding that's necessary to sort of help students actually survive and finish, and what can we do about that piece of it?
Okay, so let's take those three questions and try and move on. So from the panel, would you like to kick off, Vikki?
Maybe I could take the second question about would you be happy to trade off excellence for equity? I think that's how the trade is framed within this notion of a formal meritocracy, the one that I was arguing we should abandon in favour of a fair meritocracy. So within formal meritocracy, it's based on that assumption that that merit is objectively measured, that it's necessarily unevenly distributed, that this inevitably has a social character that is not properly recognised as being social and economic in its genesis. Whereas if we take a fair approach to assessing merit, what we're basically doing when we're using contextual data to assess how well somebody has done in school, and we say, you're from a very low-income family, you've been to a low-performing school, you live in a very deprived neighbourhood, but you've stayed in school, and you've got some okay GCSEs, and you managed to get 3 Cs at A-level, whereas almost none of your peers in the same circumstances as you have managed to do that. That is a tremendous achievement. That is indicative of great merit, great potential, perseverance, all of the things that we'd actually are markers of excellence, certainly if we nurture that into the future once that young person comes to higher education. So I think the equity excellence trade-off is a misrecognition of the capacities and the abilities of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I don't think we need to think of it as a trade-off at all.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess if Rajani wants to come in, I guess I'm always torn on this issue as to whether or not we know trickle-down economics didn't work, and does trickle-down knowledge work either in terms of the spillover effect of what Rajani refers to as world-class universities. So let's just take this in the round. If we look at the percentage of students who actually we spend a lot of our time looking at and reporting at, is probably less than about 1%, 1 or 2% attending, called the Oxbridge in this country, Ivy League in the US, and the other percentage of students we spend less time thinking about and certainly less money funding. So this seems to be also a conundrum between how we match all these things as a society. Rajani, you want to?
I think that was a very interesting question on equity and excellence as well, and comes to the heart of much of what we disagree about. And I think I agree with Vikki that we always think about excellence as having to be something to do with the minority. And what the Colombian experience is telling us is actually you can have academically excellent research, prestigious universities, that also play a role in equality. It doesn't have to be a trade-off. And I would never want to trade excellence for equity. And it's very interesting to take an example, for example, a medical school. As a patient, I don't want a doctor that's come in on an equity ticket and is not an excellent doctor. But that actually doesn't mean that we have what we have in most countries, which is the most socially advantaged elite students are doctors. If we look at the case in Cuba, which has access for all groups, Cuban doctors have historically been fantastic. But they come from very, very different social strata, because Cuba doesn't look at academic performance. Cuba looks at academic potential. So how do we actually look at potential in all countries in the way that Vikki has also mentioned?
Okay, maybe we might take also the question of looking at new institutions or new types of institutions and what kind of changes. Do you want to speak?
I was going to go on funding.
Okay, right, go for it.
So, I mean, I agree. I think there has to be new forms of education. Why broadly our education system has not been really developed since it was created. Like, it is mainly, a traditional university route, and as a result, unless you are really a full-time undergrad student or postgrad student accessing a full-time course, those routes there's very few other routes to access, university. Yes, you can do it in part-time, but that's just cut up from the full-time provision. People don't really like 2-year degrees, accelerated degrees. There are different ways, I think, of delivering that. In terms of funding, I've seen some of the balance sheets of universities. I think some of this is about political choices. If I was to ask everybody what their capital bill is within a university, it's fairly high. I'm not going to talk about VC salaries, although if there was an elected officer on here, I imagine they would. But broadly, I'm thinking there is money in institutions, and it's a choice of what you choose to prioritise and how you choose to cut up the pie. And I do think this is important. And one of the anecdotes I'd use is, TEF. Whilst we have lots of problems with TEF. It's very interesting that as the TEF metrics have come out, all of a sudden money's become available for units to start to deal with black attainment. Interesting that when we start to drive data and work out whether people will be judged in excellence, all of a sudden institutions have managed to be able to find cash and resource, and PVCs responsible for things, and departments popping up all of a sudden. So I think that is interesting. And on equality trade-off, I believe in a definition of equality where you treat people differently so they can have the same opportunities. And I think if we applied that context into HE, you could have someone from a socially disadvantaged background becoming an excellent doctor. We choose not to allow that to happen right now. That is our choice, not anybody else's choice. It is institutions' choices to restrict that opportunity. And so I think it depends on how you view the definition of equality.
Excellent.
I just want to jump into and follow up on Vikki's and Rajani about the discussion of the trade-off between excellence and equities. So my view is this. About the... Is it cooking now? No? Okay, I'm going to speak louder. About the trade-off between excellence and equities across higher education institutions, I think we don't need to have this trade-off. Actually, world-class universities should see it as their mission to build local capacity in poorer countries, where the quality and capacity of local institutions is much weaker. This can come in the form of joint program, it can come in the form of direct investment of foreign university to set up campus in poorer university. It can come in the form of exchange program or sharing of curriculum or health training, local academics. Now, about the inequality in access to institutional, to university, I must admit that I'm a little bit skeptical of contextualized admission criteria, because I would prefer the bottom-up approach where you try to improve the schooling outcome of all students rather than level down and penalize those from privileged backgrounds. a major role of university is to provide skilled worker for the labor force. And that skilled worker will help contribute to economic growth, which will increase the size of the pie and increase the level of water and raise all the boats. So if there's a large number or a large proportion of disadvantaged students who got into university because they get more favorable admission condition, yes, it's fair for them, it's good for them, but is it unfair for those who are do well but come from advantaged background? And what will be the impact of such admission scheme on the outcome, on the quality of the graduates who come out of university after that?
Okay, interesting set of issues here. Vikki, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. I mean, I think I also think that the levelling up approach is really important, and so I'm not saying let's stop trying to improve school achievement. But I guess what I'm trying to recognise is that we've been trying to do that for a long, long time with very little result, and I think in the UK context at least, I think if we rely solely on that, as some university leaders suggest that we should, and forget about contextual admissions, let's just work to raise school achievement, that we'll be here for a very long time with the same patterns of social inequality.
Okay, sorry. Does Rajani want to come in, and then we've got a couple of speakers as well.
I just want to link up something that Rebecca said in the first session, and Tristan implicitly was talking about how do we change the institution also in order to make students comfortable. And I think here we're talking about cultural capital and economic capital and the relationships between the two. And I think that, as Ben was saying, it's very, very important to be bringing in different types of curricula from different cultures, from different histories, from different countries, and I agree with that completely. But from my experience of setting up a higher education institution in South Africa, which tried to do that, the best way is to start with what students know, with what students are comfortable with, to acknowledge their own identities and communities, but also then to take students further, and somehow to bring the two together is one way in which I think universities and higher education institutions can be transformed.
Okay, we have more here, Fiona, Cathal, and yourself. Right. We have 4. Okay. Right, Cathal.
Thanks very much for the panel putting a very interesting, observation together. But I would like to put forth a question. Given very limited resources, so what would then be your policy advice for government? On the one hand, we are talking about equity, but on the other hand, we make sure that's excellence. Resources always limited, and any higher education system tries to be globally competitive, despite the fact that no one can give a very clear definition about what does it mean about world-class university, but everyone has tried to concentrating the resources for booming a selected field. This is a reality. So what's then the policy advice for any government, on helping their system grow? The second issue I very much agree about role differentiation. But again, many parents and individuals, they still prefer, university, they're more academic. They look down about vocational and technical education. What's then their why? What's then the way forward? Thank you.
Okay, can you pass that just behind you to Fiona?
I'm Fiona Ross from Kingston University, St George's, University of London. First, a bit of sort of information really. I think we've been talking about access in quite generalised ways. I'd like to point out that actually contextualised admissions have been established for about 10 years in medical undergraduate recruitment. And certainly St George's has been doing that for a long time. Secondly, having run a healthcare faculty as a dean, we use value-based recruitment into our nursing programmes and physiotherapy. We would not accept somebody who we would regard as a failed medic onto one of our programmes, because that is a disaster in waiting. So just a little bit of feedback, Ben, on that point you made. But what I really want to talk about is actually the cultures of organisations and institutions. And I think you argued, Ben, perhaps not quite your words, but that universities actually perpetuate inequalities rather than actually address them. And the way that they're run, in the way that they're gendered hierarchies, and the way that the universities have ignored the BME attainment gap, which is a sector-wide issue, which you quite rightly point out. I think you used the word criminal. So my question for the panel is, what are we doing about addressing culture change within our organisations, turning the lens actually on ourselves in terms of how we design curriculum, how we promote our staff, the sorts of workforces we have, and the leadership.
Hi, I'm Catherine Wolf. I'm from UCL Medical School. So I'm always interested when people talk about doctors and the outcome of higher education. And I think it's really interesting. So my question is, what does success look like, and how do we know when we've achieved it? So I think, and what I'm thinking about is in medicine, one of the discourses for widening participation is to provide patients with something a bit different that maybe suits their needs a bit more as well. So I think, we're talking about potentially changing entry criteria, but then we kind of want to funnel everybody into this system where they end up, where they're all competing against each other in a similar kind of process in finals or whatever, or in the job market, in the lawyer's job market, whatever it is. So if we want to, really change all of that, what do we want to achieve? What is success, and what does it look like? How do we measure it, assess it, know when we've achieved it?
Okay. Just if you pass it behind you. Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion. I'm Shane, a policy student at UCL. So my first question is, how do you think, I think the discussion touched upon a bit about affirmative action. So what's your point of view in terms of affirmative action in higher education admission, and how do you see it in the future? And the second question is about the political independence. So I'm not sure about the context in the UK, but where I'm from, higher education is seen as like a political, so how do you think about alleviating equality and the political stance of the higher education and institutions? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go with these questions. We have a lot of meat here and not a lot of time. Ben, can I start with you?
Oh my God. I take on board your points about medicine. We talk about medicine, and what I'm not saying is somebody who's not, capable of passing med exams that should become a doctor, but let's give those people a chance, and able to get them through that process. Is the point I'm trying to make. I'm going to talk a bit about the leadership and the limited resources. We have to, as a sector, with students, with business, have to talk about the way in which we talk about higher education more broadly. Being a pilot is a fairly vocational training course, and I wouldn't imagine anybody criticising or downplaying a pilot's qualification. Or I'd actually argue that being a surgeon is a pretty vocational, training opportunity. It's not, they're not sitting in, 2 hours of lectures looking at books. They are physically doing that work whilst they are studying. And I think we have to talk about this more publicly, because there are misconceptions, and I think those misconceptions are really dangerous, and they create the architecture which means that people are forced to, at very early choices, be failures. When children are watching TV and they see a job that is traditionally seen being delivered through university, it is already a step that they are being pushed into or not. So I think we have to look at that. I think that is intrinsically linked to the question of the original round, which is about the new forms of education that we need to step out of. I think it links into the second point, which is about leadership and organisation. HE takes so long to do anything in. It is unbelievable how long anything takes. And we have to get better at being quicker. Sometimes I've sat in committee meetings where I've seen a paper fly around for about a year. I'm like, can we just make a decision? And I say that in jest, but I think that's partly about, again, it goes back to the organisation. We have to become more flexible. We have to become more adaptable. We have to be able to change quicker as the new generations of learners are coming through, particularly because our workforce is a lot older than the new generation who are arriving. Your experiences of education were different to mine. My experience of education is different to the next set of students that I'm talking to when I work with student unions. And we have to keep up pace with that. And I don't think our organisations are very good at it. And I think it goes back to the final point I want to make is about data. I believe that equality data is really important. And I don't think at universities, at the top of the structures, we are doing enough to look at the data in specific terms. And I use the TEF bit as a bit of a joke. Okay, we all have our issues with it. But it is very interesting when I speak to senior leaders wandering around who are now very concerned about a bunch of metrics, which, 3 years ago, they were less worried about. They weren't talking about those in public spheres. So if we started to talk about the black attainment gap publicly, and people had to literally publish their black attainment gap, I think people would do something about it because people would stop going. People would work out, is it worth me spending this money if I know that my chances compared to the white person sitting next to me are so radically different. I think if some people in lecturing staff knew about it, we may choose to teach differently. We may choose not to participate in some of the things that maybe allow that to continue to happen. And so I think, there is a thing there about data and also about learning the pace of change and the pace of the way in which students are engaging, etc., means that workforce development is critical in universities, and it's very hard. And I think there is a lot of work that we need to do on workforce development and training and development and organisational leadership and change in order to have flexible, dynamic, innovative organisations that move very quickly rather than organisations that keep status quo and slowly move around the sector, which is where I think we all feel very comfortable in, but it's not the future that we probably need.
Okay, thank you. So, do you want to?
Okay, so I think Ellen just asked me to comment a little bit about the situation of funding to higher education, what would happen when funding is limited. So I want to address this with a case study of Vietnam, which I happen to know a little bit familiar with. So the situation in Vietnam is this. The higher education sector is small, the system is small in terms of both capacity to take in students and small in terms of quality as well. But the sector is highly subsidized by the government. Because the government is poor, the government budget is limited. So the investment in higher education is limited as well. A step to take forward is to allow more financial freedom, financial autonomy for higher education institutions to charge what they want and use that revenue to invest into their own student and their infrastructure. Another step to do is also to allow the private sector to set up institutions to provide higher education services and allow for more foreign investment to set up institutions in the country as well. But the consequence of this process is that tuition fee increase, triples, double, or in some cases can be 10 times higher. The fee in highly subsidized university is pretty low for a high-income household. It's affordable for middle-income household, but it's already high for low-income household. So if this existing fee increase, what's going to happen to students? How do they afford? And this is when I come back to my suggestion of having a universal, well-designed income contingent loan system so that the student can access higher education for free at the point of access, but the government can scoop back most of that loan money as revenue in the future. That will ease their budget as compared to providing widespread grant or scholarship to students to help them finance education. But at the same time, allow the government to have more money to put back into the system and expand the system in the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We're rushing to I'm going to ask our two other panelists to make a final comment, and then unfortunately we're short on time. So, Rajani.
So, quick comment to Kaho Mok. What advice would I give to governments? One is, if you're putting so much money into world-class universities, make sure what benefits you're getting. Actually trace those benefits, and the responsibility should not just be to remain at world-class stages, but also to build capacity in the system as a whole, to develop differentiated funding and policy mechanisms so that different types of institutions are valued for what they do, and they compete against each other rather than compete against the world-class universities. The success, what do we mean by success? I want to take it a bit wider than medical schools, and I think I would say a higher education system is successful if it's contributing in some way to a civilized society. And what I mean by that is not just that it contributes to freedom of expression, it contributes to democracy, it contributes to voting, but to more basic things. The fact that people have enough food, that everyone has access to help, and that we don't have very, very high child mortality rates like we have in the USA, one of the richest countries in the world.
Okay, thanks.
Just to add then to the question that you asked about how do we measure success, how do we know if we've got there, and to bring it back to the issue of access to study. I think you're absolutely right that we can't stop at the point of admissions. We absolutely need to be thinking about graduation rates, achievement rates, labour market destinations, the whole student life cycle as it's now called. And it's not obvious, I guess, where what the end state is that we're aiming for, but we know what the current state is, and we know what direction we need to be moving in. And to be perfectly honest, I'd be just happy to see some movement in the direction of travel that most of us, I think, are looking to see.
Okay, well, this has been a really rich conversation and discussion. Lots of really interesting issues. We could go on. I could go on. But anyways, I'm aware now that we are past our time, so I want to thank you all very much. Particularly thank our panel for provoking a discussion, and have some lunch.